Well, George, thanks so much for willing to do this interview. And I don't want to embarrass you, but I know you're clearly one of the most distinguished and successful scientists. And did you also always know you wanted to be a scientist?
I was originally going to be a mathematician.
You
but
were?
It turns out I didn't have the, as we usually say, brains to do that. I was deterred. And I was really good at washing dishes. So I've become a chemist.
How early did you know you were wanted to be a mathematician?
Oh, that was part of the sort of adolescent feeling that the closer you got to mathematics, the better off you were. So there were mathematicians, and then there were physicists, and then somewhere down the road there were the rest of us. It was okay.
Were there scientists in your family?
My father was a chemical engineer.
Uh-huh.
So my first introduction to science, as it were, was pouring coal tar through a little hole to measure the viscosity of coal tar black. And I was a technician. He was a chemical engineer who made concrete repair compounds.
So was he happy that in the end you became a chemist?
Well, I came from the Midwest, and in the Midwest, what real men do is they go into business or they go into the Army. And as an absolute worst thing, just before you go onto the street, you go into teaching at a university. But it was sort of okay because I was at MIT and they're engineers at MIT. It wasn't bad.
Are you yourself surprised by kind of the way your career has developed?
To be honest, I've never thought about it, but I'm happy with the way my career has developed because I've reached my geriatric whatever, and I wake up in the morning and I love it. It's great stuff.
What are you looking forward every day?
It's a combination of things. What's interesting about science is that you have the opportunity to do things that are important to people, and you have the opportunity to follow your curiosity, and it's fun, and you can actually make a living doing it. What more can you ask?
So, as a kind of a chemist, are you kind of not a better person to ask, the nature of molecules? And I have to think about. I think it was Feynman who said that. Suppose that all science disappeared, and there was like one bit of knowledge that we could transfer to future generations. He would say something like, "Well, all matter is made out of very small particles. That perhaps is the best clue to give." Do you agree with that?
The thing about chemistry is that's chemistry, everything you see is chemistry. So that if you really want something that has the characteristic that it's universal, it's molecules and how you construct reality based on atoms. Now there is a little business of the mind, and what happens in between matter and mind is a different story. But that's molecules too.
But going to the matter at this moment or something. So what do we learn, in fact, that things are made out of little building blocks? What does that tell us?
It tells us about the enormous variety that one can get from a pretty limited set of things. Because the periodic table is a pretty substantial list, but most of them don't show up very much. I mean, the number of occasions during the day in which you see promethium or something like that is very small.
Yes.
On the other hand, if you just imagine the variety that comes out of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen and oxygen, it's what we call life. And that's truly phenomenal. And so the idea of the almost infinite variability of forms of matter and function and use that you can get by taking a pretty simple collection of starting materials, I think is one of the most remarkable things that I know.
If you think about that variety, we might naturally think about all the materials we find, rocks and life forms that we explore, that we discover. But I guess we're also now in a phase where we can kind of start to build things that haven't existed before.
You can build many things that haven't existed before and for which there has been no imaginable use. I mean, a perfectly good example is silicon and transistors and the internet. But you take a perfectly ordinary and fairly commonly available element, which usually in nature occurs in a slightly different form, but it's nonetheless silicon, and you take it and you clean it up, and then you write lines in it in interesting ways, and all of a sudden it starts doing computation for you. Now, how on earth does that happen? And of course we understand it, but that's a combination of just the particles we were talking about, but also electrons and then this other intangible stuff called information. And it's the mixing of the three that produces such interesting and remarkable results.
Do you feel that it's the purpose that kind of led to the material, or did the material led to this kind of unexpected useful purposes?
There's a very interesting book that's appeared recently called The Idea Factory, which is history. There are many history of Bell Labs, but this is one history of Bell Labs. Many of the histories of Bell Labs go along the following narrative. That is, they say, brilliant physicists, unconstrained by reality, produced condensed matter physics and the transistors and the internet and all the rest of that. It's a wonderful example of all this. Terrific, yes. And it's a good story. But according to the guy who was running Bell Labs at that point, it is unrelated to reality. Because in fact, Shannon and Schrieffer and Bardeen and the rest of them were brilliant physicists. That's not the issue. But they were basically making a more efficient and profitable telephone system. And so, the thing about utility... So your point is it was all focused by improving telecommunication. But there was a function. Yes. People wanted to talk to their brokers in New York or whatever it might be. And so, since that function couldn't be accomplished by anything that existed, they had to make up something new. And they tried other things and ended up reinventing the world. But it was the desire to do something new, not the desire to invent per se, that I think made it happen. So
there's this great lab that makes all these products, which is called nature,
right,
and evolution. So can you say something how does nature operate and how does technology operate? Where are the differences or perhaps similarities?
In a sense, there's a similarity, because if you believe Darwin, and I'm a great admirer of Mr. Darwin, nature operates by the idea of fitness. Now, what does fitness mean? You get into wonderful arguments about what fitness means, but it basically ends up with the idea that whatever processes got us here rather than porpoises or snails or something of that kind. And part of the reason we got here is that we were able to invent things that do not otherwise exist to accomplish purposes, some good, some bad, which other creatures haven't been able to do so well. So what got us here was the ability of our particular evolutionary experiment to do something that others couldn't do. Us as human beings. Yes. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that if you say that what counts is experimentation and new ideas and adaptability, we're probably not the only thing that's ever going to be able to do that. So there will be other kinds of adaptation and evolution. And so if one looks into the future and asks, are we necessarily the end of the line and the best thing will ever happen? I don't think there's much evidence that that's true.
But you're making the point that if you look at our technology and how we develop it, that in some sense it's evolution that brought us to that point.
It's evolution, but it's evolution in a funny sense, because you can make an argument that one of the golden eras of science was the period between the 50s and now. There's an enormous amount of stuff that happened. A lot of it happened because of World War II. I mean, the inventiveness that went into winning the war or not losing the war produced enormous benefits at the same time. And many of the things that happened earlier can be associated with good and bad motives.
Yes.
So it's a question of how we use things. And the argument is that science is agnostic about this and amoral. I'm not sure any of that's necessarily true, but there are good and bad uses for most of technology.
So you said there was some kind of selection mechanism operating at that point too, because we were really fighting for survival.
And what will we do with nuclear X?
Yes.
Where X is power, X is weapons, X is who knows what it's going to be.
If you think particular, let's first focus on the more kind of material science part. If you look at the coming of new materials now, look what we know and what is still out there to explore. I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of forms of matter we haven't discovered yet. How do you see this process going, and how do we find our ways in this kind of infinity of possibilities?
Well, the question is, what do we want to do? Because it's the function that drives invention.
Yes.
And one characteristic which is not always clear from the outside is that invention has a kind of ramp quality about it. That is, coming up with an idea can be fairly easy. There are lots of good ideas. Demonstrating an application is a little bit more challenging, because you have to know something. But the actual process of taking the idea and taking it all the way to what we call a product, but even more so to a market, where lots of people want it, is very expensive and very difficult, in fact. So that at the end, science becomes technology if people want the function that it provides. Now, what function do we want?
Right.
And I think you can make an argument, for example, that the functions are probably the same in some sense that they always were. We want to be fed. We want to have our children raised in reasonable ways. We want to be safe. We want to communicate. We want to be amused. And each one of those will be served in different ways. But one of the interesting changes now is, I think, we've become accustomed to the idea that information is probably as important as things. Mm-hmm. And we are growing accustomed to the idea that machines may be as capable or more capable than we in certain tasks. And so you put together us, other parts of life, machines, and information, and you start having a world which actually doesn't look very much like the world of just 100 years ago.
And you feel that it's this combination of factors that will become the driving force for exploration. That, will machines, for instance, help us explore?
It may be that machines can only do the exploration, but of course what they learn we can use. But do we want to go and land ourselves on Pluto? Certainly not in the near term. Mm-hmm. We have a problem.
So you mentioned also kind of the whole, biology, the life science, our own bodies are part of that kind of nexus. How do you see, from your point of view, and I think as a chemist you're like perfectly positioned, the material world and life, and how are these two worlds interacting at this moment, and what will bring the future?
Well, that question is, I think, one of the more interesting questions that's around right now, because there is a fundamentally interesting issue there, which is there's matter, mm-hmm. and there's life, and are they different, or is life just matter? And I have a prejudice in this, which is a hypothesis, let's mm-hmm. say. And that is, we have matter like this, which is stationary. Mm-hmm. And then we have matter of a different sort, and the example I like is a flame, mm-hmm. which is matter, but it's doing something, and it only really exists because it's doing something. It's generating energy, and you mix methane and air, and you let it burn, and you get a flame. What's life? And one argument is that life is a very complicated sort of flame. You mix glucose mm-hmm. from breakfast, or in my case, caffeine, mm-hmm. with air, and you burn it, and by a very complicated process, you end up with a behavior which is not giving off heat and light, but it's giving off Beethoven in this conversation that we're having.
Yes.
And is that all there is, or is there something else there that we don't understand? And I think that's the great question. Is there something, we say, emergent, something that is not anticipated by existing science that distinguishes life from everything else, or is it simply a marvelously balanced by some set of processes that we don't understand set of molecular processes?
I could imagine that, again, from the chemical point of view, you might be perhaps biased to think the latter, and you think that it's just a very complicated process.
Well, I don't know that just is the right word, because yes. just is a way of being a little bit dismissive.
Yes. Yeah.
What to me is so interesting is the idea that if you can have static matter, you can have dynamic matter, you can have living matter, and you can have thinking matter, then this whole process leads you to the idea of how on earth and why on earth would you arrive at something that was dynamic in the sense of being alive, and mm-hmm. even more so, being dynamic in thinking.
Intelligent matter.
Intelligent matter. But the importance of the question, I think, is that if you can have intelligent matter based on hearts and blood and whatever, then there's no reason why you couldn't have intelligent matter of a number of different sorts.
If you think in perhaps more kind of a grayscale, where you have various kind of gradations in which matter is alive or intelligent, might these questions be answered soon in terms of real objects appearing, perhaps produced in laboratories that are kind of exploring that intermediate area?
There are, I think, two questions there. One question are there examples in which that line is already blurred?
Yes.
And I think there are many of them. And one that I think is worthwhile thinking about is simply a frozen egg, mm-hmm. human egg. There's no chemistry going on. It's mm-hmm. doing absolutely nothing. There is nothing in that would suggest it's any different from a rock. Mm-hmm. But you warm it up, and yes. all of a sudden it's able to do something different. And you see in a sense the same thing at the thought perspective, because a human egg, when fertilized, isn't thinking. There's nothing to think with.
Yes.
And when a baby's born, it's not thinking much. I mean, there's thought going on, but it's probably certainly not self-aware.
Yes.
And then you end up with all of the semantic problems that you and I have in trying to understand what thinking is about. It's a continuum. Both of these are continua.
Mm-hmm.
So what that says to me is that you can go from something that is not alive to something that's alive, and from something that's not thinking to something that's thinking in a continuous way. And the thing about continua is that they usually go on.
Yes.
So there's...
We're not the end point of that curve.
We're not the end point in that curve.
Yes.
That's right. And so you say, isn't it dismissive to think that we're just a flame? And the answer is no, absolutely not, because what you want is more complicated flames.
Right.
And that gives me a great deal of optimism that whatever we are 1,000 years from now is not going to be what we are right now.
So I could imagine, there are at least two kinds. We can kind of have objects which are more kind of in between life and kind of dead matter. But we can also think of that these things will start to kind of enhance us. Is that something that you see happening soon?
Well, is a self-driving car fundamentally different in its function from a cab with a really bored taxi driver?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a bored taxi driver is, it's almost certainly safer.
Yeah.
But the bored taxi driver is probably not thinking about a lot, including driving the car.
Yes.
And whatever set of systems is driving the car in a
Mm-hmm.
vehicle that's unmanned is something quite different. But they're both sort of operating on a low key. So, yeah, why not? Why can't we have many variations on complexity, and why can't we, more interestingly, begin to combine them?
Are you envisioning seriously that artificial intelligence or deep learning processes will start to kind of change not only our lives, but perhaps also the way we kind of do science and discover things?
Well, isn't it already happening?
Mm-hmm.
Because after all, we have had the pleasure of having our younger son home with us. And it's very clear that he is thinking about things in a way that's fundamentally different from the way that I've ever thought about things. I mean, the internet has rewired his brain. Yeah. Let's assume for the better, but I don't know that to be true. But it has to do with the fact that for him, the idea of all information is available, you just assume it. Of course all information is available. Now what you do with it and how your intuition works, it works along different veins. So it seems almost guaranteed that this process of us as adaptable creatures adapting to an environment which now has all this other stuff going on which wasn't there before, it has to happen. It's as if there's some new competitor come along, or the temperature has changed, or whatever has happened.
And so evolution is kicking in again.
Evolution is kicking in.
Well, how do you feel this particular? I think you mentioned the internet and the way we're communicating. It's not only operating at an individual level, but also the kind of amount of connectivity, the way we are connecting to other people and other.
But it's really
source
that.
of knowledge. It's amazing. And does that give a different perspective on what it means to be a human being? You feel?
What's a human being?
Well, instead of just looking at us as individuals, that in some sense we should now look really as more as a collective process.
What I think you can argue, and we will see how it works out, is that the internet has rewired the brains of our children and grandchildren in such a fashion that they are part of a collective as opposed to being isolated. Mm-hmm. And there are good features and bad features, but the integration is very much a work in progress. And what will come of something in which not only is all information available, but all opinions are available, as we're beginning to see, plus or minus, with who knows what wild oscillation in this system as we begin to shake down and trying to understand what a collective intelligence is like. Mm-hmm. But a collective intelligence could be a next step, and it would certainly be very different from what we're doing now.
If you kind of try to have a kind of a broader perspective, and you see this kind of development of technology, which you just said, is really speeding up the last, say, 50 years. Do you have the feeling that we are kind of entering a new age in terms of technology, what the role of technology will be? Something like perhaps comparable to when we had like the Industrial Revolution or something?
I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. The question that I struggle with is what's the form going to be?
What's the characteristic?
What's the characteristic? Because if we have enough matter of this sort to do many things, but we're just beginning to explore the intersection of this with this with information,
Yes.
you end up with a very different kind of picture. And it's not clear that I or even you will live long enough to have a sense for what direction this is going. But I think the direction is going to be different.
If you're speculating, I think clearly, machines and technology are becoming more and more important. In the end, will it be about us, the story, or are we just kind of an intermediate phase that kind of passes the torch to perhaps a smart machine or something else?
Well, no, there is the argument, and I think you may have heard about this from Martin Rees, that we're just a little glimpse in between a period in which you don't have sentience on the one hand, and then you have the real thing, which lasts for a very long time and is based in silicon or it does something else. I don't think it's easy to see the answer to that, but it certainly is true that you can understand that there are things that the internet can do that we can never do, because I've spent a lifetime learning stuff, a very brief lifetime learning stuff. I die, it's gone. But that won't happen with other forms of memory and intelligence. They will be there forever.
Well, your scientific achievements will definitely live on and be carried on. So, aren't we in science in some sense also part of a much longer chain?
We are. I know that we all like to have the idea that there's some residue.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't. What happens is you understand stuff, it's incorporated into things, and then immediately it's taken for granted. So it's not that we don't contribute, but there isn't much residue.
It's the flame.
It's the flame. That's right. You turn it off, it's gone. But while it's there, it's hot and it's useful.
Talking about machines, you think that in the future there will be more machines around us? For instance, robots.
Well, there's an interesting word that you just used, which is machine.
Yes.
Is a structure that thinks as clearly as we do and can do things that we can't do, although it operates on different principles. Aren't we dismissing it a little bit to call it a machine? My lawnmower is a machine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about something rather different.
Yes.
Anyway, robots. Robots were developed, of course, originally to replace people in tasks that were not doable or difficult or unpleasant. Lifting body panels into an automobile assembly line or working in a mine or things of that sort. And that's worked really very well. And there are a series of what are machines which have the unpleasant characteristic that if you happen to be standing too close to one of them, when it swings its arm, it simply cuts you in half and doesn't notice. So one of the things that's beginning to happen now is the development of what's known in the trade as collaborative robotics, meaning robots, by which I mean very broadly almost anything that's a machine that interacts in a dynamic way with its environment. Robots that are designed and do work cooperatively and safely with people. It's a very important kind of distinction, because with cooperative robotics, one can imagine then the step in which, on the one hand, we already have us thinking together with machines, computers that think all the time. We're very happy with that.
Yes.
And if we can now add to this something in which we interact with machines, and maybe even machines that look like us, although I don't think that's necessary as a part of this, then you fuse the two together, the corporeal self and the information thinking self, in ways that you can't tell the difference. Then all of a sudden we've done something which is really remarkable, which is, depending upon your point of view, creating a living or thinking peer competitor or cooperative species. And how we make that out will depend upon how things go. I can't answer the question.
Are you in any way worried that these cooperative new species will kind of dominate us or take over?
In the short term, no. And we have a wonderful example when people bring up the issue of, aren't robots taking jobs? Yes, of course robots are taking jobs. But in the 1930s, there was a very important class of robots introduced, not called a robot, but it was a washing machine and a dishwasher.
Yes.
And what these did was to take 50% of the population, otherwise known as women, who were spending their time basically washing things, get rid of all that and allow them to go on and do all the other things that people, women, men, do.
Yeah.
So
liberating.
What it did was to create opportunities to do more interesting things. So if we assume that what will happen with advanced information systems, artificial intelligence, robotics, whatever it might be, if we assume that that will take over some of the less interesting jobs, and there are many of those, then the question is, will we be clever enough to have other things that need to be done in which this can work? And the answer to that, of course, in a kind of, I don't know, ethical sense is yes, because pick your number, 70% of the world's population still lives, if not in poverty, in difficult circumstances. And one could go about basically improving the standard of living, health, housing, education for everybody. Or we could do something else. And we'll probably try both.
I just want to also kind of come back to evolution. And as you said, now at this point we are at this phase where technology enters and becomes part of it. But if we trace back in the other direction, we talked about the kind of mysterious properties of matter that has come alive. I know you also think about the origin of life.
Right.
Because that's somehow the essential question. That might be the point where we go from one phase to the other. What are your thoughts about that?
To me, the origin of life is the most interesting question I know in science right now. I mean, absolutely the origin of the universe and space and time, these are wonderful questions. But we don't actually have very much contact with the origin of the universe, so it's not an everyday event for me.
Yes.
On the other hand, you and your colleagues are everyday events, and where could they have come from?
Yes.
I have no idea. And the characteristic of a good scientific problem is you don't know the answer before you start.
Yes.
But it's all well and good to say that you have a flame, but how a flame becomes the remarkable set of things that is represented by life is not at all obvious. And there are two parts to this question. There's a part which is Darwinian evolution. So once you have a cell, how does the cell become, over many, many, many generations, how does it become Beethoven? In a vague way, we understand how that could happen. How do you take random sludge being irradiated by a UV-rich sun and boiled by volcanoes and things like that, and have that turn out to be the first cell? I have no clue. And so what's wonderful about it is that I have a feeling there that at least in the detail, we don't understand what's going on at all. But, and the but is interesting, what it does say is that it's possible to take things that seem totally disorganized, but have energy, and have them, by some process, bootstrap themselves into something that's totally different in terms of its characteristic.
Yes.
We don't understand really how that happens. In very vague terms, yes, but how does it really happen? I don't know.
Well, I mean, if you wonder about the origin of the universe or something, it's intellectually, of course, very stimulating question, and the same is true for asking what happened 4 billion years ago, on planet Earth. But I could imagine that the question of the origin of life is also quite relevant for now studying complicated processes, etc. Something, it's something that you could possibly replicate or could show processes that we weren't aware of.
Perhaps, but that implies that if we're going to do it now, it implies that we sort of know how it happened. Because if you look at what seems to be required to make the simplest cell, it is so complicated that it doesn't seem likely to have happened by accident. There has to have been some direction in terms of going downhill in energy or something. We don't know what that might be. And I don't think we know what that is. There's a real difference in the opinion of the community that thinks about this. I happen to think we don't have a clue. There are people who think
we're almost there.
We can go from pond scum to the first cell.
Yes.
And then there are people who think that once you've gotten to the first cell, you don't have to worry about the rest of it. You just assume it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
how do you think in the end we'll settle that question? What kind of do you at least see a pathway of investigation getting to the answer?
Yes, I think there are pathways of investigation. So, from the kind of approach that we take, not knowing how to do it, we ask the question of how do you take reactions and how would reactions begin to interact with one another cooperatively? How would they self-assemble? And if you could do that, if you could find out principles which would suggest that, then you might be able to think that maybe in this environment that set of things might have become a group not of 5 separate reactions, but 5 reactions that are somehow working together and talking to one another. But what I just said, how do reactions talk to one another? We know how it happens in life now, but we don't have any idea how it could have happened in life then. And so it's a wonderful problem.
George, we were talking about your origin of life.
Right.
I just want to make a little detour. What you feel about life in the universe? Are we alone?
We don't know.
Yes.
I mean, the issue there is that if you're in the muddle I'm in, which says I can't see how it happens. If it happens by accident, it's so improbable that I have no way of getting my arms around it.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the sort of number is you hold your arm at arm's length and look at the size of a quarter, and in any direction, that's 1 billion galaxies included in that.
Amazing.
And the 1 billion galaxies has 10 billion suns, and most of the suns have planets, and they're experimenting all the time with everything. I have no idea how to think about
Over
those
billions
kinds of
and
numbers.
billions of years.
Over billions and billions of years.
Yes.
So there's lots of room for things to happen. If I had to bet, I would say that it's one of two possibilities. Either there's only one, or it happens all the time, everywhere. And
Yes.
I don't know what the answer is.
You think we can find out, if we find out somehow the origin of life, will it also tell us something about what could have happened, can happen at other planets and other...
I think it'll answer everything. If we have an idea that it actually is not so hard, maybe you have to have the right conditions, then with all those experiments, it's bound to happen over and over and over again. But there are probably events that are very rare. I don't think we have any idea how often a universe forms. How often does nothing burp into something? How often does lifeless burp into life? I don't know how to estimate that kind of number.
I like that word, the big burp.
The burp, yeah. Big Bang. It's the same B, but it's a different idea.
Big burp is much better.
But the issue of evolution is also interesting in another sense. When Darwin thought about evolution, he was thinking about finches. And
the Galapagos finches.
The Galapagos finches. And he was thinking about predators and prey and surviving in competition with other competitors. At the beginning, if you think about the beginning, there were no competitors.
Yeah.
The first cell had no living competitors because it was it. And probably what it had to do more than fight off competitors and breed fast, it had to fight off the consequences of meteor strikes and volcanoes and things of this sort. So that it may well be that what at the beginning was Darwinian evolution was actually robustness, the ability to survive dramatic change. And then that evolved into the ability to run faster than either what you wanted to eat or what ate you. And now the question is, for the future, what is going to be the vector for evolution? What will we be running toward or running away from? And I think it will be very interesting if we both run away from and toward something which we have created. That's an interesting idea. Because we are one of the very few species that likes to be both predator and prey for ourselves.
So you were also telling us that we are struggling with many of the issues that we created ourselves.
Many of the issues we create ourselves.
What are the things that you worry about?
What do I worry about? I don't know. I don't worry about much because there isn't that much you can do. But the kinds of things that I think in a personal sense one worries about is everyone has a vector. Mine happens to be children. I care about children. And so as a child, you are basically raised in our society to do work, and ideally work that makes a difference. It's meaningful work, whatever meaningful is. If we find that we've handed everything over to some other form of machinery, then we've got to figure out what people do. What do people do to fill the day? And that, I think, is a little worrisome, because I'm not sure, even now in Western Europe and in the United States, we have the constitutive problem that there are more people than there are good jobs for people. And when that happens, everyone becomes mischievous. And mischievousness amplified with nuclear weapons leads to real trouble.
What do you see as the role of science, and particularly also technology, in this? I mean, you could argue again, it's technology is operating on both sides of the equation in some sense. It's creating lots of problems, but often it's also seen as one of the few solutions of these problems.
There's no shortage of problems. I mean, just think for a moment. We have the environment. And the environment, everyone is interested in energy and everyone is interested in CO2. We all recognize it's a problem, and we really don't have a good way of solving it. Probably the best way is going to be the most acceptable way will be to reduce energy usage.
Yes.
The other way, of course, is to reduce people.
Mm-hmm.
And the most benign way of solving both of those problems is probably education, and education isn't very popular. So I don't know whether we've got that. But there's that kind of issue. We as human beings are creating a social construct that didn't exist ever before in history, called the megacity. Mm-hmm. So 50 million or more people living in a small space. And we have no idea how these things operate. Mm-hmm. But they have to operate well for the people.
Yeah.
And I think about this as being a purely chemical materials problem. You have energy coming in, you have food coming in, you have waste going out, you think about stuff spreading, both information and epidemics. You have to do things with the individual components, but that will be done by a distributed system. I mean, it's a wonderful problem. And then you have...
And you see technology in some sense as having opportunities to that.
I think that will happen.
Will happen, yes.
I mean, one has I think, a very interesting construct in Europe called Ludwigshafen. Mm-hmm. And Ludwigshafen is the home of BASF, which is one of the few, real chemical companies standing. And it's an enormous plot of land, which is basically one factory. Mm-hmm. And a megacity is almost the same thing. And they're the same basic kind of construct. Stuff comes in, energy is used, stuff goes out. But we know how to run Ludwigshafen because we created it.
Yes.
We don't have any idea how to construct a megacity because it created itself. Mm-hmm. And there's a very interesting question, I think. If you look at the usual definitions of life, self-aware, energy using, dissipating, food in, stuff out, self-replicating, would you say that a city was alive? I would.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me to have many of the right characteristics. So we've talked about the internet, but it may be that cities fall in the same category. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there's the population of the world that is still poor and hungry. I mean, an enormous number of problems there. There's the basic question of how we deal with the detritus from the past. I mean, there's just an enormous number of problems. How do you ease the pain and suffering of dying, because we're all going to die? How do you do this? So there's no shortage of problems. The question is, how do you provide the education, the interest, the resources so that people are engaged in solving these problems, mm-hmm. which will be what we call jobs, as opposed to watching their handheld devices, which is not a job.
Or making things even worse.
Right. Well, I don't know whether it's going to make it worse, but it's a little bit of drawing a blank card.
Is this motivating? We're talking, George, about the problems in the world, and I want to ask you, is that motivating your own research? If you go to the lab, are you thinking about addressing some of these big challenges?
It is a major motivation. And my argument for it is that my salary and the salary of my students is paid for by people who deliver the mail and pump gasoline and things like that. And the process, you can follow the money. The process is that they produce money, they and corporations produce money, which they give to the government, which we all give to the government, not because we're good people, but because we go to jail if we don't. But in the back of our mind is the idea that something comes out of it. The government spends it for security and education and good things of that kind. Then the government, of course, has no way of actually doing anything with money because it just is sort of a bag man. So the government takes the money and gives it to a tiny fraction of it to universities and sometimes to corporations on the theory that this makes for better outcomes. And then the universities have no way of doing anything either. Mm-hmm. So whatever they come up with, knowledge or invention or whatever it might be, has to be handed to another entity, which is generally called a company, to do something with.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, that produces something which society recognizes, the person who put up the money recognizes as a benefit. Mm-hmm. But if you don't go through that, it becomes self-referential. It becomes academics saying that we deserve to be supported because basically we're stunningly beautiful. Mm-hmm. And actually we're not. We're just like everybody else. Mm-hmm. So the world is full of problems, and both from the point of view of helping to pay the bill, you get the money, you should give something in return, and also because it is so immensely stimulating to work on a problem that you have no idea how to solve. We should do it.
What are particular problems that motivate you?
The one that we work on is we're very interested in health care for the developing world. And in much of Africa, some parts of South America, Western China, there are lots of places where things have gone wrong, actually, in much of the Middle East now for different reasons. There are people who have very little access to healthcare. They have very little access to hospitals. They can't do what we do in the United States, which is we feel sick, we go to the emergency room, and all of a sudden, all the panoply of stuff is available. So how do you provide help? And my argument, at least in part as a chemist, that you can't fix it if you can't measure it. So that if you're a physician, you want to help, you have to know help at what? And that's diagnostics. And so
it's knowledge of the body.
Knowledge of the body and knowledge of the disease or the injury or whatever it might be. So the question is, how do you provide information in a way that's accessible to people who do not have front-end hospitals working with them? And it's a very interesting problem because it actually superimposes almost on problems in animal health and problems in environmental monitoring and the problem of the city and other things. And what one asks, as I would say more an engineer than a scientist in this regard, is taking everything that you know, can you come up with stuff that helps to fix this problem in a way that's affordable and easy enough that anyone can use it, and it's simple, and you can't really screw it up? And I think the answer is yes, but it's not straightforward.
But on the other hand, probably it will involve some very kind of highly advanced technology and investigations, right? I mean, it's you're not doing basic stuff here. You're really
I think the answer
exploring.
is yes. I think the answer is yes and no. The actual work that we do is to make diagnostic systems that are based on little pieces of paper. And the origin of this idea was that we were looking for some way of making systems that pumped blood around and things of this kind, in which we could adapt something that existed before for that purpose. And what we settled on was making comic books. Because making comic books, if you've ever seen a rotary press, it generates enough pieces that big, or enough area, if you think about it this way, to cover the surface of the Earth in one run. It's 30 miles an hour in a 16-foot web. It's amazing. So that technology was there. All we had to do is, in a sense, think of how to use it.
Amazing.
And that part is actually trying to make things low end and as simple as possible. And simple is not easy. A transistor is simple, but it's not easy. And then the high end part of it is that the assumption is everywhere that healthcare now will not be ever again just patient and doctor, but rather patient, doctor, archival patient-based database, epidemiology that covers a good fraction of the world, a history of all diseases of that sort. We're not there yet.
Huge data sets.
Huge data sets. And so that's the highest end. So putting these things together is what, in the sense, is interesting. How do you take something which is designed at the level of individuals to be as simple as they can be, but at the level of collectives is more sophisticated than we can really imagine?
Thinking about also the collective, so the kind of immensity of data, and perhaps everybody's life history and medical history. It's kind of interesting that somehow analyzing this is really a collective thing, right? It's no longer doing that. We somehow do this as a species, as a planet.
Right. But even there, you see it very much just looking around any room. You can tell if you walk into a room, pretty much, even not a doctor, who's healthy and who's not. And the big things are weight, exercise, and you can tell that by how people move, not smoking, and you can tell that by watching them when they smile. Their face either breaks up in normal crinkles or in plaques. And they have to look basically slept, and they have to get enough rest. It's not all that complicated. Now, lots of other things happen when stuff begins to go wrong. But we have a model in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and many places of high-end end-of-life medicine. And it comes from this basic idea that life is invaluable. So we will spend any amount of money to keep you alive.
Do anything that's necessary.
Anything that's necessary. This doesn't make sense to me. But if you take that point of view, then you tend to focus on people who are already sick rather than the obvious, which is keeping people healthy. And my idea is that drop off the edge of the cliff rather than slowly sink into the swamp like the baby hippopotamus in La Brea.
George, are you fundamentally optimistic about where the world is heading and where life is heading?
I'm fundamentally immensely optimistic, but I don't know optimistic about what, because I don't know how it's going to come out.
Do you know why? What motivates your optimism?
I think as a species, we have tended to get better. Mm-hmm. And life is not as miserable. I spend very little time worrying about whether I'm going to be set upon by robbers, whether I'm going to make it past my 30th birthday. These kinds of things are not a problem.
It was not that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago that it's 100 years ago.
Yeah.
All of this was unknown. Children died of we regard perfectly preventable disease. Yeah. What's happened a little bit is that it's the genie out of the bottle problem. We've released the internet. We have nuclear weapons. We have the ability to do things which we use for good, but which, if we're dumb, we will use the wrong way. And so the question is a little bit, are we smart enough to keep the car on the right side of the road, or do we insist on driving in the wrong way?
I found interesting, there was an article I read by John von Neumann, I think from the mid-50s, with the title, Can We Survive Technology? Mm-hmm. And his conclusion was that it's like basic human qualities that help us answer that question, just decency, careful deliberation. Are you agreeing with that?
Yep. And the argument that comes into technology and comes into science, which I actually quite profoundly disagree with, is that it is a subject which is distinct from ethics and human values. Mm-hmm. The ethics and human values do not help you solve problems in quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, without ethics and human values, you don't know what problems to solve or how to solve them or what to do with the answers once you have them. So one of my major problems with education now, at least at the graduate level, is that we teach students what to do with enormous skill, but we don't teach them why to do it. Mm-hmm. And is that the right thing to do? And I think not for them and not for the society.
You think that we need these kind of moral and ethical dimensions to literally to survive?
I think we need them to survive in a more direct way. I think as a student, if I were going into a field, science would be one because it's so interesting and actually has the potential for impact on society. But I would like to have the feeling that I'm doing it because it's important, not because it's career advancing. Mm-hmm. And that's something you can do in science. It's not necessarily something you can do if you're in other professions, some other professions. And to minimize that potential pleasure of doing something that's not only interesting and technically challenging, but also helps other people seems to me like a worthwhile thing to pay attention to.
Are you worried that our technologies and our insights become so advanced that they basically are ununderstandable to many? We talked about quantum and quantum mechanics, and many people have not a clue what this is, and this might yet be driving our technology.
Well, yes, but I don't. Do you have a clue of how the internet works? Mm-hmm. I mean, no, nor do I. I mean, I know how a transistor works, sort of.
Yes.
But do I really know? And one of my annoyances in life is that I spend a fair amount of time on airplanes, and on the sides of airplanes are these things called wings, and the wings hold the airplane up. How do they do that? And I've never quite believed that it works, and yet
you see it with your own eyes.
It goes up.
Yes.
That's
but
right.
It's a miracle.
That's right. It's astonishing to me.
Yes.
And when you start talking about the more sort of homey things like watching a baby develop, it's unbelievable. How does this happen? Now, it's not technology, but if you say that technology and life are just parts of the same, different chapters of the same book, then there should be common principles.
George, you talked about the wonder of seeing an airplane go up or a baby develop.
Right.
Is that sense of wonder important for you, just as a scientist?
What I live for. Mm-hmm. I mean, curiosity is a phenomenally useful characteristic for a human being to have because you're never bored. because you can never understand the world around you completely. So there's always something interesting going on.
So you're motivated by that, what you don't know?
Motivated, I'm amused and interested, and then some small parts of that become motivation, and some even smaller parts become problems to work on. So, but if you look at anything and say, how does that happen? You can never answer the question. So it's an endlessly interesting business.
You have some kind of intuitive image about how much we don't know, or how much is out there in terms of things to be discovered and explored.
Right, but there's also there's a certain humility that comes from looking at something, recognizing that you understand finally how it works, and then coming back a week later and recognizing that you were completely wrong and you have it totally off base.
Yes.
And that happens over and over and over again.
Is that true? Were there moments in your own career that you were totally wrong?
Yeah. And essentially every moment. Anytime I say that I understand it, I know I'm wrong. It's just a question of how long it's going to take to find it out and what the nature of the wrongness is.
Is that fundamental to science, that you always it's always kind of moving?
It has to be, because the wonderful thing about quantum mechanics in particular is that it describes a world that we can't really understand.
Yeah.
Let's assume it's right,
yes.
Which I don't 100% know, but let's assume it's right. And how do I understand it? And things like interference, for example, I used to think this was okay. Interference was okay because it was something that happened with electrons, whatever an electron was, or a photon, or things like that. But now I find that Mr. Zollinger can take atoms and molecules, actually big molecules, and run them through two slits, and it does whatever happens.
They behave like an electron.
Like an electron.
Yes.
I have no idea how to incorporate that idea in my universe.
And I always think quantum mechanics, whatever the amount of introspection and thinking, you would never come up with that, right? It's something that we were taught by nature, and we were very difficult students, and it took a long time for us to appreciate it.
And then these arguments that say that perhaps space-time is quantized. Okay, I have the words, but if you say to me time is quantized, then that raises the question of what's going on in between
the
bits of time, and how do I describe that? And it's clearly not an understandable notion. Now, it may be that I've phrased it wrong and it's something different, and if you think about it in a more sophisticated way than I can, you can get your mind around it, get a grip on it, but I can't.
Are you surprised how far we came in terms of understanding the world around us? It seemed to be absolutely spectacular, and there seemed to be no signs like forbidden for human beings or something.
Well, yes, I'm amazed because, of course,
there was no promise that we would understand, right?
Relative to, it's always relative to what? And if you say that there's some gigantic examination that we're involved in, and there's a score of 0, and we're clearly not at 0, and then there's a score of 100 in terms of understanding, and I don't know now whether we're at 5 or 95 in any of these areas. One of the things about chemistry is that actually the basics of putting together molecules and matter we understand to an extent. We can use it. The toolbox is well designed. What to do is a different issue.
Yes.
When you start talking
this is this
about
question of basically you're the designer and what to make.
Right.
You have the materials.
That's right.
You understand the materials.
But then if you take the next step and say that the problems now are megacities and public health and the poor and the environment, all of those are problems in which you're dealing with collections of things, you're dealing with systems, and the solutions for an individual part of a system are not necessarily the right solutions for the system. So we may have to redesign with a totally different set of design rules, which are the system's rules, as opposed to the individual component rules, and that opens the whole book again.
Well, that's going back to our beginning of our conversations, where we said it's so great of building blocks that you can make anything out of it.
But if the building blocks have the characteristic that you make something and it turns out to be exactly what you wanted to be, but exactly the wrong thing for what turns out to be the problem which you didn't understand at the beginning, then you can stay amused doing that. That's right.
George, if you go to, part of this series also that we kind of describing the various kind of, I would say, kind of personalities that we find in science. Because we might study the same phenomena, but there's a great diversity also in the personal approach. And I I'm looking here at this animal that's on the table. Tell me what it is and why it's there.
This is a warthog, and my wife bought this model back from someplace from Zambia or wherever she was, and I'm very fond of it. And one reason for being fond of it is that I do believe that in the idea of totems. You know, a totem is an animal that you think might embody some of your best characteristics. Mm-hmm. And so I have two, and one of these totems is a rhinoceros. And the reason I like rhinoceros is that it's not a particularly bright animal, and it solves problems by going through the problems. Concrete wall, you go through the concrete wall, mm-hmm. You don't go around the concrete wall. And I feel an emotional kinship with that. And then these are so beautiful, these animals. They're, you know, not maybe to you and to me, but to their mothers. They're so beautiful. And so I feel I fit in that category too. So I'm for both of these animals.
If you look around and you look at your colleagues, do you see other animals in a natural way?
I do. And they run all the way from the most glorious of creatures to others. Uh-huh. And one, it would be impolite to make that two-column Excel spreadsheet, but it's there. An issue which is an interesting one, about which we haven't talked, is the division between science and engineering, or more properly, I think, the fact that that's not all there is. Mm-hmm. So there's an argument now in the United States that science and engineering are just slightly different colored versions of the same thing. I think that's not correct, mm-hmm. because scientists really like to understand things, even if it's not necessarily useful. Yes. And engineers have this wonderful enthusiasm for taking something that basically exists in some ways and making it better. Yes. I mean, it's a different point of view. But there's a third part of it, and maybe even a fourth part. Mm-hmm. The third part is invention. Mm-hmm. And people who are inventors are the ones who go from not 10 to 100 or 1 to 10, but from 0 to 1.
Give me an example of a canonical example of an invention.
And a canonical example of an invention is probably a transistor, because mm-hmm. there was no such thing before, yes. and it came into being for a different reason. But a stool or a fire, I mean, these were, a wheel was invented by someone, yes. and your invention is not necessarily a flash of lightning. It may be a process that gets you somewhere, but it nonetheless creates an idea, a concept of how the world could be that wasn't there before. Yeah. Yes. And so we need to be a little bit careful not to say that you can be a scientist or you can be an engineer, but that's all there is.
Perhaps also the difference between inventing something and discovering something.
The two are related. In one case, you look at the world and you see what's there that you don't understand, and you abstract an idea from it, and that's the charm of much of the interface between physical sciences and the biological sciences. Life offers so many interesting opportunities to do that. But the other is sometimes you just are curious. You say, could this be done? Counterfactual thinking is actually, I think, very useful in science. Because if you get up in the morning and you say, the sun rises in the east, and you realize that what you're really saying is that every day I've looked at it, the sun rose in the east, but what would happen if the sun rose in the west? Mm-hmm. You are sometimes led into pathways that are quite interesting, and sometimes you're led to go nuts.
Right.
But, both work.
Yes. What about the other disciplines? Particularly if you think about invention or something in creativity, I also naturally think about the arts.
You think about the arts, yes. And they, of course, operate in a somewhat different way, but with the same kind of process. If you look at the arts, which is, so far as I can see, a human construct, it's a construct of thought, mm-hmm. and you ask how that happens, and what do they come up with, and how does that work? It's astonishing. And part of that, which is actually fairly interesting, is that if you read as a child, as I did, science fiction, mm-hmm. it's easy to look back and say, well, all they did was think about spaceships and the internet and life on other planets. But what you have to realize is they thought about all this before none of these ideas were there. I mean, they created
even
a world
arms.
Which has come into being. Yes. And it was an astonishing act of creation. And in the same way, people create, of course, societies, and they create personalities And the people who do this know things that we haven't gotten a grip on in some way. That is,
this is also about the power of our imagination. So how important is that imagination in driving us? I mean, and how do you kind of explain this, that we can see things, imagine things that aren't there yet?
I don't think we know. And one of the interesting notions about, for example, machine intelligence is that it is showing us things that we have not previously appreciated. The interesting baby example was AlphaGo, the program that had the characteristic that it actually defeated the world's champion Go player. That's not so interesting, but what was interesting to me was that there were apparently 1 or 2 games in which the program made moves which the human player apparently would not have made. Now that's creation.
Yes.
And it's creation in a very defined universe with a tight set of rules, but that's okay. I mean, we know that will change.
I found it interesting that actually this defeat of human beings by a machine actually led to a lot more interest in Go, because particularly with this element, that this might be an incredible enriching process for understanding the game.
One of the things that crops up in science fiction is the notion of systems that can make very rapid decisions. And if you look at an area which has tended to be one which stimulated great creativity in this sense, which is warfare, you find exactly that's going on, because those systems make decisions in ways and at distances and in wavelengths we can't begin to really get a good grip on.
Yes.
So it's happening, and everywhere around you look, you and your group has a drone. Drones didn't exist 10 years ago, and now drones are everywhere. You know, our little eyes, flying around and looking for us in interesting directions. So the opportunities for change are absolutely everywhere. If you're curious about, can I make a bookcase fly? Yes, I can make a bookcase fly.
We talked about artificial intelligence. Should we also talk about artificial imagination?
That's a question to which the answer has to be yes, but whether you and I can talk about it, I don't know. Imagination is the ability to imagine worlds that don't exist. That's not enough, because it has to be an interesting world that doesn't exist, or a world that doesn't exist according to rules that people have not taken for granted.
Yes.
And it is counterfactual. I think it's basically a notion of imagining what cannot be, assuming it to be, asking how you get there, and then asking what happens once you've gotten there. So there is perhaps a process, but it's not something which everyone necessarily does in a way that has an influence on those around them.
George, we talked about the evolution of life, and taking, from its very mysterious beginning through great complexity to the emergence of intelligent life. And now we are in this phase where certainly, human beings, but also, very smart programs and machines and computers are kind of linked together. How do you see this? I mean, if you just take almost like a planetary perspective, it looks almost like the planet is coming alive and becoming an intelligent by itself.
Yes. I mean, if you throw out the issue of replication, why not? Why not have a planetary intelligence that consisted of everything? One of the more interesting technological things that's come along in the last period of time has been the ability to read signals from the brain and use those to cause intentional motions, to run a robotic arm or something like that. It's pretty primitive at this point. But what it...
Connecting our mind to, so to say, the mind of the robot.
The mind of the robot.
Yes.
And it's at the level not of thought, but at the level of action. I mean, it's mechanics. But it's a step. And it's a really interesting step to a world in which you don't have to have physical connections to have things happen. Now, you say that, well, there's no way of going from that to something which is more to do with thinking. On the other hand, having tried Oculus Rift, I can't tell the difference between that world and the real world.
That's a virtual reality
world. That's a virtual reality
yes.
world. And so you put all of this together, And all of a sudden you begin to imagine moving things at a distance and looking through the eyes of those who are not you at these things in wavelengths that you can't imagine. You will build memories from that. I mean, you will construct your own reality from that. So I don't know that I necessarily have to think what you're thinking, but if I experience what you're experiencing, it may have the same effect.
And I'm shaping your brain, and you're shaping mine.
Yes. You're welcome to go at mine if you like.
If you take a even more kind of a wider perspective, think of it, of the cosmos. I mean, the title of this series is The Mind of the Universe. Is that a grandiose overstatement, what we are doing here on planet Earth?
Well, we got a problem when one goes long distances, we think, because of little issues with speed of light. But on Earth, that's not such much of a problem, really. We are a little limited, but not that much limited. So is there any reason to think we couldn't have global connectivity? We have global connectivity. Now it's just a question of having it adapt and evolve. And what it evolves into, what will be the evolutionary pressures on a system in which there are no competitors? And
because there's only one, like the first cell.
That's right. But of course, there was only one cell at the beginning, and it evolved its own predators.
Yes.
Yeah. That makes one a little uneasy. I mean, this is outside of my lifetime, but it's not necessarily outside of lifetimes 20 generations from now.
Yes.
And in fact, you can argue, I suppose, that hacking is a little first, it's one finch throwing a stone at another finch or something of that kind.
Going back again to the beginning of your life, when you told that you were, as a child, interested in math and science, kind of looking back, everything you've seen, are you amazed by just what happened, what you've seen in terms of science and research and technology?
You have to be amazed. Of course one is amazed. I mean, one is amazed every day. There's a little bit of a problem in that kind of question because I would have been amazed by almost anything.
Yes.
Children don't know anything, so everything is amazing. I mean, if you ask what's the best scientist, and everyone who thinks about it would agree the best scientist in the world is a 2-year-old who invents all of Newtonian physics, balls falling down and all the rest of it, while inventing language, while doing all the rest of it. It's just truly phenomenal what they do because they're really interested, because if they don't get it right, they fall down. It isn't the ball.
So it was downhill from there.
It's downhill from there in a certain sense. But, I think one would be equally amazed by just going out and looking at the world.
Yes.
What you get in science is the ability to intervene. And that makes, to me, a world of difference. I just think it's so much fun to figure out, I think that might work that way. Well, if it works that way, maybe if I poke here, something will come out over there. And I poke here, and it doesn't, it comes out over here. And that, that really gets you up in the morning.
Thank you for sharing some of that fun with us.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.